I still remember the sound of my father's laughter echoing through our living room that Christmas morning in 2019. It wasn't the warm, jovial kind you'd expect during the holidays. It was sharp, cutting through the festive atmosphere like a blade through wrapping paper. I had just handed him my gift, a simple wooden box I'd crafted during my off hours at Fort Campbell, where I was stationed as a logistics specialist with the 101st Airborne Division. "Really, Alex?" Dad held up the box, turning it over in his hands with barely concealed disdain. "After all these years in the Army, this is what you bring home? A little wooden trinket?" His voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment I'd grown accustomed to since enlisting 6 years earlier. Mom shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her fingers nervously adjusting the hem of her Christmas sweater. The box wasn't much to look at, I'll admit. Made from reclaimed oak I'd salvaged from an old barracks renovation. It measured roughly 8 inches square, with simple brass hinges I'd purchased at the base exchange. The surface was smooth from hours of careful sanding, and I'd burned a small American flag into the lid using a wood-burning kit. Inside, I'd lined it with deep blue velvet, the same shade as our dress uniforms. "It's not just any box, Dad," I said, trying to keep the hurt from creeping into my voice. "I made it specifically for what? Storing old buttons?" He chuckled again, setting it aside with the casual dismissiveness reserved for unwanted mail. "Your brother Jake brought us that beautiful crystal vase from his law firm's Christmas party. Now that's a real gift, something with actual value." I watched as he picked up Jake's vase, holding it up to the light streaming through our living room window. The December sun caught the cut crystal, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls of our modest ranch house in Lebanon, Tennessee. Everything about that moment felt calculated to diminish what I'd spent weeks creating in the cramped workshop I'd set up in an unused corner of the motor pool garage. My younger sister Emma, home from college for winter break, shot me a sympathetic look from across the room. She understood the hours I'd invested, the careful attention to detail, the way I'd worked on it late into the night after long days managing supply chains and coordinating equipment movements. But Dad had already moved on, asking Jake about his latest case, his promotion prospects, his new apartment in Nashville's trendy Gulch district. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to help Mom with dinner preparations, but really to collect myself. Through the window above the sink, I could see our neighbors' houses decorated with twinkling lights and inflatable lawn ornaments. The Hendersons next door had their usual elaborate display, complete with a life-size Santa and reindeer that played jingle bells every hour on the hour. What Dad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the box represented something far more significant than a simple woodworking project. Hidden beneath that blue velvet lining was a secret compartment, and inside that compartment lay something that would soon change not just how my family saw me, but how our entire town of Lebanon would remember Christmas 2019. The secret compartment contained a single USB drive, no bigger than my thumb, but it held information that had taken me 8 months to compile. During my deployment to Afghanistan the previous year, I'd witnessed something that haunted my nights and drove my days. A systematic failure in our supply chain that was putting soldiers' lives at risk. Faulty body armor, substandard ammunition, medical supplies that arrived months past their expiration dates. I'd documented everything, cross-referenced serial numbers, photographed evidence, and built an airtight case that implicated not just military contractors, but several high-ranking officials who'd been turning blind eyes in exchange for comfortable post-retirement consulting positions. The wooden box wasn't just a container, it was my insurance policy. I'd crafted it specifically to house this evidence, designing the hidden compartment with the same precision I applied to managing logistics operations. The brass hinges weren't decorative. They contained tiny magnets that would trigger a secondary latch system, accessible only if you knew the exact sequence of pressure points along the box's edges. Back in the living room, Dad was regaling everyone with stories about Jake's latest courtroom victories, barely acknowledging my return. I picked up the box from where he'd carelessly set it on the coffee table, running my fingers along its smooth surface. The weight of what it contained, both physically and metaphorically, felt heavier than ever. "You know, Alex," Dad continued, not even looking in my direction, "maybe it's time you considered a real career. Jake's firm is expanding. I'm sure they could use someone with your organizational skills in their mailroom or filing department." The suggestion stung more than I cared to admit. 6 years of military service, 3 deployments, commendations for excellence in logistics management, and he saw me as mailroom material. Mom cleared her throat uncomfortably, while Emma's jaw tightened with barely contained anger on my behalf. What none of them understood was that in 3 days, I had a meeting scheduled with investigative journalist Marcus Webb from the Nashville scene. Webb had been following military contractor corruption for years, and when I'd reached out through encrypted channels, he'd immediately recognized the significance of what I'd uncovered. The story was set to break on New Year's Day, with simultaneous publication in the scene and pickup by major national outlets. The evidence in my wooden box would expose a corruption network that stretched from Tennessee to the Pentagon, ultimately leading to congressional hearings and criminal prosecutions. Several contractors would lose billions in government contracts, and the reforms that followed would save countless military lives. My testimony would be crucial, and my careful documentation would become the foundation for new oversight protocols. But sitting there in my childhood living room, watching Dad dismiss my craftsmanship while praising Jake's corporate achievements, I felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. He saw a simple soldier who made wooden trinkets in her spare time. He had no idea that his daughter was about to become the whistleblower who would expose one of the largest military procurement scandals in recent history. The box sat quietly on my lap, its secrets safe for now, while outside the Hendersons' inflatable Santa continued his hourly rendition of Jingle Bells, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Marcus Webb in a dimly lit corner booth at Hermitage Cafe, the kind of place where truckers and night shift workers grabbed coffee at odd hours. Webb looked exactly like I'd imagined. Rumpled blazer, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of intense focus that made sources feel both protected and slightly nervous. The wooden box sat between us on the worn Formica table, looking almost innocent next to his digital recorder and scattered notebooks. "Before we proceed, Sergeant Martinez," Webb said, using my rank with the respect Dad never seemed to manage, "I need you to understand the magnitude of what you're about to set in motion. Once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your life will change permanently." I nodded, my fingers tracing the familiar grain of the oak. These contractors are killing our people with their greed. Someone has to speak up. The weight of 8 months' worth of sleepless nights pressed down on me as I demonstrated the hidden compartment mechanism, watching Webb's eyebrows rise as the secret panel slid open to reveal the USB drive. For the next 4 hours, we went through everything. Serial numbers of faulty equipment, photographs of expired medical supplies, email chains I'd meticulously documented showing the paper trail of willful negligence. Webb asked pointed questions, cross-referenced dates, and occasionally let out low whistles of amazement at the scope of what I'd uncovered. "This is Pulitzer-level material," he said finally, leaning back in the booth. "But Alex, you need to understand, when this publishes on New Year's Day, you'll be the most famous whistleblower in the country. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" I thought about Dad's dismissive laughter, about Jake's crystal vase sitting prominently on Mom's mantel, while my box had been relegated to a dusty shelf in the guest room. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," I told Webb. "I just didn't know it until now." The story broke at midnight on January 1st, 2020, simultaneously across multiple platforms. By 6 a.m., my phone was buzzing incessantly with calls from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every major newspaper in the country. The headline read, "Tennessee Soldier Exposes Massive Military Contractor Fraud. Exclusive Evidence Reveals Deadly Cover-Up." I was still at my apartment near Fort Campbell when the first news van pulled up outside. Then another. By noon, there were 12 media vehicles lining the street. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. My commanding officer called to inform me I was being placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, but his tone suggested pride rather than punishment. The phone rang again. Mom this time, her voice shaking. "Alex, honey, there are reporters at our house. They're asking about you, about some box you made. Your father. He's been trying to reach you all morning." Through my apartment window, I could see neighbors gathering on their porches, pointing at the media circus that had descended on our quiet military housing complex. A reporter was setting up for a live broadcast, checking her microphone while cameramen adjusted their equipment. The wooden box sat on my kitchen counter, empty now, but somehow more significant than ever. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Senator Patricia Hayes' office. The senator would like to speak with you about testifying before the Armed Services Committee." Everything was about to change, and there was no turning back now. The media attention was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the phone call I received that evening from Colonel Patricia Hendricks, my commanding officer's superior. Her voice was clipped, professional, and carried an undertone that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Sergeant Martinez, while we appreciate your dedication to exposing corruption, there are proper channels for these concerns. Channels you bypassed entirely. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. We're conducting our own internal investigation into your allegations, but in the meantime, you're being reassigned to Fort Bragg, effective immediately. Pack your things. You leave tomorrow. The reassignment felt like punishment disguised as protocol. Fort Bragg was across the country in North Carolina, far from my family, far from the journalists who needed my testimony, and conveniently distant from the brewing congressional investigation. I tried to protest, citing my scheduled testimony before Senator Hayes's committee, but Colonel Hendricks cut me off. Your testimony has been postponed pending our internal review. The Army will determine when and if you're available for congressional hearings. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the growing darkness of my apartment. Within hours, the narrative began shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. A counter-story emerged on several military blogs and conservative news outlets, painting me not as a whistleblower but as a disgruntled soldier seeking attention. Anonymous sources claimed I had performance issues, that I'd been passed over for promotion, that my allegations were the desperate actions of someone with a grudge against the system. The worst part was watching my family get dragged into the controversy. Reporters camped outside Mom and Dad's house in Lebanon, asking neighbors about my character, my childhood, whether I'd always been a troublemaker. Jake called me in a fury, claiming that reporters were harassing his law firm's clients, asking if he supported his sister's reckless accusations against military contractors. "You've made us all look like fools, Alex," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Dad's been getting calls at work. Mom can't even go to the grocery store without someone shoving a microphone in her face. Was your moment of fame really worth destroying our family's reputation?" The isolation hit harder than I'd expected. At Fort Bragg, I was assigned to a desk job processing routine supply requests, a clear demotion from my previous role managing complex logistics operations. My new colleagues treated me with polite distance, clearly having been briefed about my situation. During lunch breaks, conversations would stop when I approached, resuming only after I'd moved on. Marcus Webb called regularly with updates, but even his news was troubling. Several of the contractors named in my evidence had hired powerful law firms and were threatening defamation suits. Some of the military officials I'd implicated were claiming the documents were fabricated or taken out of context. The USB drive that had seemed so damning in that wooden box was now being challenged by teams of lawyers and expert witnesses. "They're trying to discredit you before you can testify," Webb explained during one of our calls. "It's classic damage control. Attack the messenger, question the evidence, delay the proceedings until public interest dies down." Meanwhile, Dad's attitude had shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. When I called home, he barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were sharp with disappointment. The wooden box, once dismissed as a worthless trinket, had become a symbol of what he saw as my betrayal of military loyalty and family stability. The turning point came on a gray February morning when I least expected it. I was sitting in my cramped cubicle at Fort Bragg, mechanically processing a routine request for medical supplies, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made my blood run cold. "Sergeant Martinez? This is Captain David Chen, stationed in Kandahar." His voice was strained, urgent. "I got your contact information from a mutual friend. Ma'am, I need you to know. 3 of my soldiers are dead because of the faulty body armor you documented." My hands began trembling as he continued. "The contractors replaced the defective batch you identified with an even cheaper alternative. The ceramic plates are cracking on impact. We've had 4 casualties in the past week alone, and I have reason to believe more units are receiving the same substandard equipment." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been sitting in administrative limbo, while lawyers argued about documentation and politicians played procedural games, soldiers were dying. The corruption I'd exposed hadn't been stopped. It had simply adapted, found new ways to cut corners and maximize profits at the expense of American lives. "Captain, I need you to document everything," I said, my voice steadying with renewed purpose. "Every serial number, every incident report, every piece of evidence you can gather. Can you do that?" "Already started, ma'am, but I need to know. Are you still fighting this?" Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they've successfully buried your story. That night, I made a decision that would either vindicate everything I'd sacrificed or destroy what remained of my military career. I called Marcus Webb and told him about Captain Chen's revelations. Then I did something that violated every order I'd been given since arriving at Fort Bragg. I reached out directly to Senator Hayes' office, bypassing military channels entirely. Senator, with respect, soldiers are dying while we wait for internal investigations, I told her chief of staff during a secure call. I have new evidence that the corruption is ongoing and expanding. If we don't act now, more families will be planning funerals instead of homecomings. The response was immediate and decisive. Senator Hayes announced emergency hearings for the following week, stating that the safety of our military personnel cannot wait for bureaucratic convenience. The announcement sent shockwaves through both the Pentagon and the contractor networks I'd exposed. Within hours, my phone was ringing again. This time it was Colonel Hendricks, and her tone had shifted dramatically. Sergeant Martinez, you've been recalled to Washington for congressional testimony. Your reassignment to Fort Bragg is being reconsidered. But the real turning point came that evening when my phone rang with a call from home. It was Dad, and for the first time since the story broke, his voice carried something other than disappointment. "Alex," he said quietly, "I just watched the news. They're saying you have new evidence that soldiers are still dying. Is that true?" "Yes, Dad. It's true." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Then you keep fighting, you hear me? You keep fighting until every one of our boys and girls comes home safe." The dismissive laughter from Christmas morning felt like a lifetime ago. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent chambers. I sat at the witness table, facing a semicircle of senators whose expressions ranged from supportive to openly skeptical. Behind me, the gallery buzzed with reporters, military families, and contractor representatives whose expensive suits couldn't hide their obvious anxiety. Senator Hayes called the session to order, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "Sergeant Martinez, you understand that your testimony today contradicts official Army findings that deemed your original allegations inconclusive?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my voice steady despite the cameras focused on my every movement. "But I also understand that 3 more soldiers died last week because those findings were wrong." The lead attorney for Blackstone Defense Systems, one of the primary contractors I'd exposed, immediately objected. "Senator Hayes, we move to exclude any testimony regarding incidents that occurred after Sergeant Martinez's original complaint. She has no direct knowledge of these alleged new casualties." But Senator Hayes had done her homework. "Actually, Counselor, we have Captain Chen joining us via secure video link from Kandahar. Captain, can you confirm the casualties Sergeant Martinez referenced?" The large monitor to my left flickered to life, showing Captain Chen in his desert camouflage, the stark reality of a forward operating base visible behind him. His voice was clear, but heavy with exhaustion. "Yes, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Williams, Corporal Jackson, and Private First Class Rodriguez, all killed when their body armor failed to stop standard AK-47 rounds. The ceramic plates shattered on impact. The room fell silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. I watched several senators lean forward, their earlier skepticism replaced by grim attention. The contractor's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, whispering urgently to his client. "Captain Chen," Senator Hayes continued, "can you identify the manufacturer and lot numbers of the defective armor?" "Blackstone Defense Systems. Lot numbers matching exactly what Sergeant Martinez documented in her original evidence." Chen held up a cracked ceramic plate to the camera. "This is what's supposed to stop bullets and save lives." The Blackstone CEO, a silver-haired man named Richard Thornfield, leaned toward his microphone. "Senator, we categorically deny any connection between our products and these tragic losses. Our armor meets all military specifications." "Which specifications would those be, Mr. Thornfield?" I interjected, pulling out a thick folder I'd prepared. "The ones from 2015 that your company helped write, or the independent testing standards that your armor consistently fails?" Senator Hayes raised her hand for order as the gallery erupted in murmurs. "Sergeant Martinez, please explain what you mean by that statement." This was the moment I'd been preparing for since that Christmas morning, when Dad dismissed my wooden box. "Senator, my investigation revealed that Blackstone and 2 other major contractors essentially wrote their own performance standards through a revolving door of former Pentagon officials. The testing protocols were designed to pass their substandard products. I opened the folder, revealing hundreds of pages of documentation. These are internal Blackstone emails discussing how to optimize testing parameters and manage quality expectations. In layman's terms, they rigged the system to accept armor they knew would fail in combat. The contractor's attorney was on his feet. Objection. These documents were obtained through potentially illegal means and— These documents, I said, my voice rising above his protests, detail exactly how your client has been trading soldiers' lives for profit margins, and Captain Chen's dead soldiers are proof that this corruption is ongoing. The room exploded into chaos as reporters shouted questions and senators called for order. Through it all, I sat calmly, knowing that everything I'd sacrificed had led to this moment of truth. Senator Hayes slammed her gavel repeatedly, her voice cutting through the din. Order! We will have order in this chamber. The gallery gradually quieted, but the tension remained thick as smoke. I could feel every eye in the room on me as she continued. Mr. Thornfield, you have 30 seconds to respond to Sergeant Martinez's allegations before we proceed to examine her evidence. Thornfield's composure was cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his microphone. Senator Hayes, these are serious accusations being made by a disgruntled soldier who violated proper channels. Blackstone Defense has served this nation honorably for over 2 decades. That's not an answer to my question, Senator Hayes replied sharply. Did your company participate in writing the testing standards for body armor procurement? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I watched Thornfield exchange desperate glances with his legal team, their whispered conference clearly audible in the hushed chamber. Finally, his attorney leaned toward the microphone. Senator, we invoke our Fifth Amendment rights and decline to answer on grounds that it may incriminate our client. The gallery erupted again, but this time Senator Hayes let the reaction continue for several moments before restoring order. The admission had effectively confirmed everything I'd alleged. Behind me, I could hear reporters frantically typing on their laptops and whispering into phones. Sergeant Martinez, Senator Hayes said, turning back to me, in your professional opinion as a logistics specialist with 6 years of military service, what would be the immediate steps necessary to protect our soldiers currently deployed? This was it. The moment when all my preparation, all the sleepless nights documenting evidence, all the personal sacrifice would either matter or be dismissed as the desperate actions of a troublemaker. I thought about Captain Chen's voice when he'd told me about his dead soldiers, about the families who would never see their children come home. Senator, every piece of Blackstone armor currently in theater needs immediate recall and replacement. Every lot number I've documented should be pulled from inventory immediately. I pulled out the final piece of evidence I'd been saving, a memory card containing video testimony from soldiers in 3 different combat zones. I have statements from 47 active duty personnel confirming armor failures identical to what killed Captain Chen's soldiers. I inserted the card into the chamber's display system, and the main screen filled with the face of a young Marine in Helmand Province. His voice was steady, but his eyes held the weight of combat. My name is Lance Corporal Maria Santos, and 2 weeks ago, my body armor saved my life, but the soldier next to me, wearing Blackstone gear, wasn't so lucky. The plate shattered like glass. One by one, the testimonies played. Soldiers from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, all telling variations of the same story. Blackstone armor failing when it mattered most. Lives lost to corporate greed. The chamber was completely silent except for these voices from the battlefield, and I watched several senators wipe tears from their eyes. When the final testimony ended, Senator Hayes looked directly at Thornfield. Mr. Thornfield, do you still maintain that your products meet military specifications? But Thornfield's chair was empty. He and his entire legal team had quietly slipped out during the video presentations, leaving behind only their abandoned briefcases and the weight of their guilt hanging in the air like an accusation. The empty chairs where Thornfield and his team had sat seemed to speak louder than any testimony could have. Senator Hayes stared at the abandoned briefcases for a long moment before turning back to the packed gallery. Let the record show that representatives of Blackstone Defense Systems have chosen to leave rather than answer questions about equipment failures that have cost American lives. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the Department of Defense issued an emergency recall of all Blackstone body armor in active theaters. Military transport planes were already being loaded with replacement equipment from verified manufacturers as I walked down the Capitol steps, surrounded by a sea of reporters and camera crews. The questions came rapid fire. Sergeant Martinez, how does it feel to know you've potentially saved thousands of lives? Will you be seeking damages against the contractors? What's next for you? I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the building where American democracy had just worked exactly as it was supposed to. What's next is making sure this never happens again, I told the gathered media, and making sure the families of Staff Sergeant Williams, Corporal Jackson, and Private Rodriguez know their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The drive back to Lebanon felt surreal. 3 months earlier, I'd been a disgraced soldier reassigned to a desk job, my family embarrassed by what they saw as my reckless accusations. Now, my phone was buzzing with calls from book publishers, documentary filmmakers, and military reform organizations. But the call I was waiting for came just as I pulled into my parents' driveway. Alex? Dad's voice was thick with emotion. I owe you an apology. A big one. I could see him through the living room window, standing next to Mom, who was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The same window where Christmas morning sunlight had caught Jake's crystal vase, casting rainbows while Dad dismissed my wooden box as worthless. You don't owe me anything, Dad, I said, though my voice caught slightly. You just didn't understand what I was trying to tell you. No, I should have listened. I should have trusted you. He paused, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. Your mother dug that box out of the guest room closet. She's been carrying it around all day, telling everyone who'll listen that her daughter is a hero. When I walked through the front door, the first thing I saw was my wooden box sitting in the place of honor on the mantel, exactly where Jake's crystal vase had been. Mom rushed to embrace me, tears streaming down her face, while Dad stood awkwardly to the side before finally joining our hug. The box looked different somehow, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. The same oak grain, the same brass hinges, the same burned American flag on the lid. But now it represented something Dad finally understood, that real value isn't measured in crystal or corporate achievements, but in the courage to stand up when standing up costs everything. 3 weeks later, Congress passed the Military Equipment Accountability Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. Blackstone Defense Systems filed for bankruptcy, and 4 executives were indicted on federal corruption charges. Captain Chen called to tell me his unit had received new armor that actually worked, and every Christmas morning since, when Dad looks at that wooden box on our mantel, his eyes fill with pride instead of dismissal.